when the subject of the afterlife is under consideration, of course, one of the first questions to be addressed concerns the kind of state that an afterlife would be. Now, there are multiple and contradictory ways in which the afterlife has been conceived, and that's unsurprising, of course, given that nobody has experienced the afterlife and been able accordingly to report to us what it's like. We find ourselves very much then in the realm of speculation. And in those speculations about the afterlife, we find three major conceptions or models of what the afterlife would be. And they are survival of the disembodied soul, resurrection of the body, and reincarnation. And our session today is about those three models, what they mean. And joining us to discuss this issue today are Dr. Turner Nevitt and Dr. Lance Nelson. Dr. Nevitt received his PhD from Fordham University and is assistant professor in USD's Department of Philosophy. He is author of a number of very important articles on St. Thomas Aquinas, particularly on Aquinas' account of resurrection, and his translation of Aquinas' quadlibetal questions. I got right the first time. Very first English translation of that text will be published later this year by Oxford University Press. This is a massive undertaking, so we're very excited about it coming up. Dr. Lance Nelson is professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He received his PhD from McMaster University and is a specialist in Hindu religious history, focusing on classical systems of Hindu theology and the relation between Hindu religious practice and environmental concern. In addition to a dizzying number of published articles, Dr. Nelson is also the editor of Purifying the Earthly Body of God, Religion and Ecology in Hindu India, published by the State University of New York Press. I want us, though, to kick off this session by thinking about that first model. And Dr. Nevitt's going to talk to us about resurrection, and Dr. Nelson will talk about reincarnation. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about the first model of a life after death, which is immortality of the soul, or otherwise called survival of the disembodied soul. Now, this model has a very strong and long philosophical pedigree, being articulated and defended by such luminaries as Plato and Descartes, as we'll see. Far from it, however, being an arcane philosophical quirk, I think that this may be what a lot of people, at least in the West, tend to think of in a somewhat unarticulated way when they envisage life after death. The model would be the body dies, but the death of the body does not entail the extinction of the person, him or herself. This then must mean that you are something more than your body, and that in addition to possessing a body, a person also has, or better, is a mind or soul in some mysterious way, harnessed or lodged within a body. When the body dies, the soul departs this physical life and continues to exist, perhaps forever, in some other, perhaps better, realm. And that afterlife realm is spiritual in nature, as distinct from this physical world in which we currently find ourselves. Now, the disembodied survival model is evidently therefore dependent upon what's known as a dualistic conception of the human person, namely that the human person is made up of two parts, a body and a soul. This means, of course, that a major task for any believer in this disembodied model is to articulate a plausible version of dualism and to defend it from some trenchant criticisms. Now, we don't have time to think about that element of the issue today. Perhaps it might get raised in the Q&A session maybe. But, I mean, if I can be allowed a moment of personal thought, the more I think about the the dualist conception of the human person, the odder, stranger, it gets to me. It seems to largely misrepresent the relation of mind and body. This dualist notion that I am, in my essential nature, an immaterial soul, temporarily in possession of a physical body, just seems peculiar, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. That's a mild term. I typically, for example, don't think of my body as being one of my possessions. If you ask me to list my possessions, the list would include such things as my car, a condominium, a couple of decent 18th century editions of Burke's writings, a good bottle of bourbon, and so on and so forth. Now, it would be odd, I think, to add to that list of possessions a body. So that I might say, in addition to possessing a car, I also possess a body. That's just a weird thing to add to an inventory of my possessions, or it's a joke of some kind. And likewise, this notion, very frequently articulated. I teach a class where there's a strong element of philosophy of mind in it. But this notion that roaming around my body in some way is a little spirit, well, that just seems frightening to me and uncanny, a little ghostly me, animating my body as though I were a haunted house or something like this. Of course, this isn't me being idiosyncratic about it. The great Gilbert Ryle, God bless him, in Concept of Mind, one of the great works of philosophy of the 20th century, coined the term the ghost in the machine, precisely to lambast this sort of odd notion of a haunted human being wandering around the world. Anyway, let's take a look at how Plato and Descartes depicted this model of life after death. Here, first of all, here he is. This is the great Socrates, of course, looking really rather ripped. And this is a passage, a very famous passage, of course, from if ever there was a romanticized conception of a philosopher, this is it. This is a very, very important text, Phaedo, written by Plato, a text in which he reports Socrates' calm demeanor in the face of his impending death. Socrates is saying to his friends, horrified, of course, by him about to be killed, we believe, do we not, that death is the separation of the soul from the body, and the state of being dead is the state in which the body is separated from the soul and exists alone by itself, and the soul is separated from the body and exists alone by itself. Is death anything other than this? Now, death for Socrates is nothing at all to be feared. We fear death, of course most of us do, but Socrates doesn't. For him, it is in some sense even to be welcomed. Now, this is because we will leave behind the worst part of the human being, the worst part of our being, its bodily component, and be able to engage in pure thought, undistracted by the demands and follies of the body. And to repeat, death here is not the end of a human life, but rather a kind of purification of it, a sort of liberation of the soul, described by Plato as the release and separation of the soul from the body. The soul is released from the body as from a prison. You have to remember the very famous words in Plato that the body is the prison of the soul, so that death is really a liberation from prison. Just to reference the case of Descartes, here's the wonderful picture of Descartes. Here's Descartes distinguishing the human from the non-human, and in the process indicating his confidence that consciousness will continue in a non-physical state after the death of the body. There's some discourse on method. For next to the error of those who deny God, there is none which is more effectual in leading feeble spirits from the straight path of virtue than to imagine that the soul of the brute is of the same nature as our own, and that in consequence, after this life, we have nothing to fear or to hope for any more than flies and ants. As a matter of fact, when one comes to know how greatly they differ, we understand much better the reasons which go to prove that our soul is in its nature entirely independent of the body, and in consequence that is not liable to die with it. And then, inasmuch as we observe no other causes capable of destroying it, we are naturally inclined to judge that the soul, is immortal. Well, this is all very uplifting, and until you start really thinking about it. Plato and Descartes are articulating in a very warm and welcoming way the possibility of a life of pure thought, a life without the body, and therefore without all of its troubles, sickness, aches, and so on. But we have to think seriously about what a non-bodily life would be like. It would be a life, clearly, without the operation of the senses. That's what it means. You lose your senses. Now, generally, a loss of even one of our senses is not regarded as a good thing. If my doctor tells me that I am going blind, that I'm losing my sense of sight, I don't welcome that piece of news, or think how terrible it would be to lose your sense of taste. What a loss that would be. And either of those things would be bad, even if I retained my other four senses. But Plato and Descartes are expecting me to be happy at the prospect of losing all five of my senses. Now, I'm not happy about that prospect. It sounds like a terrible thing to me. So I don't know why I'm asked to welcome this idea when it seems a five-fold nightmare of loss. Five-fold nightmare of loss is also the name of my thrash metal band. On that view, of course, that was an ad lib. So it's not written down here at all. So disembodied survival might not be an inherently desirable thing. And the undesirability of such a disembodied state does not, of course, mean that it will not happen to us. It might happen, and we just have to live in this kind of awful state. It's perfectly possible. Reality is not very pleasing to us as it currently stands. There's no reason why the afterlife should be any less displeasing to us. It could be an awful state of affairs. It's a strange presumption, in fact, that life after death should be. It's an odd thought. I always think it should be very good, but from my experience of all subsequent tomorrows, they're all pretty rough and difficult. So I don't know why I think the one after death should be any better. It's an odd thought. It seems to be designed to make us feel better about how dreadful everything generally is. But leaving that happy thought on one side, other philosophers have thought that this idea of disembodied existence might not even be an imaginable or coherent state of affairs at all. We tend to talk rather glibly about the survival of the soul. Here's all the time. The soul survives after death, goes on. People say these things. But what does it mean? Survival of the soul would seem to mean, if you unpack the idea, it seems to mean what the philosopher C.D. Broad, back in the middle part of the 20th century, he defined survival of the soul as survival of a personal stream of experience not associated with any kind of bodily organism. A personal stream of experience not associated with any kind of bodily organism. One branch of criticism states that such an idea is simply unintelligible. This was, I think, first or one of its earliest expressions was articulated by Baron d'Holbach, really great and underread writer, I think, on the system of nature. He says this: an organized being, an example of an organized being would be a human being, one of us, may be compared to a clock, which once broken is no longer suitable to the use for which it was designed. To say that the soul shall feel, shall think, shall enjoy, shall suffer after the death of the body is to pretend that a clock, shivered into 1,000 pieces, will continue to strike the hour and have the faculty of marking the progress of time. D'Holbach's point, of course, is that the idea of disembodied existence after the destruction of the physical body is simply unintelligible. It's like me smashing up my television set when I get home, but still being able to watch Family Feud on it. There's nothing it can't be played. This is the idea of the physical death smashing me up into 1,000 pieces, and yet somehow my consciousness is still there. This is seen by D'Holbach to be completely unintelligible. Now, other philosophers contended not that it was unintelligible, but that the contrast between the bodily me in this world and the disembodied me in the afterlife is so great, or would be so great, that the disembodied thing barely counts as me any longer. And this was the view taken by C.D. Broad. A disembodied person, Broad wrote, would have to perceive things in some kind of clairvoyant way, instead of how we now do it via the senses, via our eyes and ears. Any sensations that disembodied person had would have to be produced in some way other than sensory stimulation. Any actions that person performed would need to be done by something like telekinesis, lifting up a cup just without my hand, by mental effort. And communication would have to be via telepathy, because you don't have a mouth with which to speak, a face by which to convey emotion. Now, Broad doesn't think that's unintelligible and inconceivable. However, his judgment is still very skeptical. Here's C.D. Broad. He's a great philosopher, I think. He's talking about this state of disembodied life, thinking via, communicating via telepathy and so on. All this is conceivable, he says, so long as one keeps it in the abstract. And this is the important thing for someone like life after death's great in the abstract. It's really easy just to throw some words around. When you try and flesh this out, fleshing out in this disembodied, and there's this kind of joke there, I suppose. When you try and pack it out, it doesn't seem to make any sense anymore. Or it's weird and foggy. All this is conceivable so long as one keeps it in the abstract. But when I try to think about what it would be like in concrete detail, I find that I have no clear and definite ideas. And if I cannot clearly conceive what it would be like to be an unembodied person, I find it almost incredible that the experiences of such a person, if such there could be sufficiently continuous with those had in his lifetime by any deceased human being as to constitute together the experiences of one and the same person. So it wouldn't be you anymore. Something might be there, but it wouldn't be you. Now, that's an important point. Now, the best defense of the intelligibility and desirability of disembodied existence was probably articulated by H.H. Price. Here's H.H. Price. In a really important paper called Two Conceptions of the Next World, in his book, Essays in the Philosophy of Religion. Price concedes that the Platonic Cartesian conception of an afterlife spent in pure thought would appear extremely dreary and unsatisfying, but he denies that a disembodied life must be limited to such cerebral activities. In order to demonstrate this, he appeals to the experience of dreaming as a possible model for afterlife existence. Our senses, he says, are not operative during dreaming, and yet this does not stop dreams from being exceedingly vibrant and exciting. Hence, a disembodied existence might consist of a great deal more than abstract thought. We could have experiences, seeming experiences, like, I had a dream last night that was very, very vivid and real. So he says life after death would be a kind of dream from which we never wake up. And there's all sorts of other things that Price talks about here. You'd be telepathically connected with other dreaming people who you have an affinity with. You'd have some kind of body. It wouldn't be a physical body. It would be a kind of image body like you have in art. And so you could somehow interact with other kind of floaty image bodies telepathically and so on. And the important thing is that Price here is using an experience with which we're all familiar, the experience of dreaming, we all dream, to indicate that a non-physical existence, an existence without a body, without real sensory stimulation, could still be an intelligible and a desirable one. This is a fairly valiant attempt. But to accept Price, of course, you have to be of the opinion that something akin to dreamlike mental activity could take place without having a body, without having a functioning brain, and thus we're thrown back onto dualism and its problems. Price thinks that there's a part of you that isn't physical. If you don't buy that, you're not going to buy this theory. But nonetheless, however well that idea is presented, it's still hard not to draw the conclusion that a disembodied existence would be a reduced, truncated kind of existence, an existence in which something has been lost. And that loss is even in the name. Disembodied, which, like dispossessed or disenchanted, suggests that something or other has been taken away. Now, someone like Plato would have no problem with that idea, since what is taken away from us, the body, is for him something to be despised. It's notorious in Plato, of course, in the Phaedo at least, that the body is something wretched and evil, even, he says. Very few of us, I think, will agree with Plato about that. Most of us, I would guess, like being embodied. Although as I get older and my back hurts more, I sort of long for a completely spiritual, non-physical life, but whatever the hell that means. But what we like about being embodied is, of course, the pleasures that the body affords us. And I'm not just here thinking of the pleasures of food and sex, of course, but of things like feeling the sun on your face, holding a beautiful, smooth object in your hand, smell of newly cut grass, and so on. All those things are, of course, physical sensations. To have lost all of that would be very, very sad, even if we had some kind of dreamlike substitute, such as Price speaks about. Peter Strawson, another great British philosopher of the 20th century, makes the point that a disembodied person in the afterlife would always have to think of him or herself as a former person. Now, the disembodied, this is a really crucial point in Strawson. I really urge you to read Strawson's book, Individuals. Great book. I'll repeat that point, it's really important. In the afterlife, the disembodied person would always think of him or herself as a former person and would always be looking back to a life from which he or she was now debarred. Strawson concluded that the afterlife personality, if we could even call it that, a personality, would be so shrunken, so attenuated, that from the point of view of his survival as an individual, there'd be very little difference between the continuation of experience and its cessation. You would just not be you anymore. And for this reason, Strawson noted that the orthodox have wisely insisted on the resurrection of the body. This point is echoed by the Catholic philosopher Peter Geach in a really important book called God and the Soul. I only realised when I was putting together this PowerPoint how old Geach got before he died. He lived a very long and interesting life. For Geach, a human person is much more than their thoughts. So if only the mind or the soul survived death, then this would not entail survival of the person, but merely survival of what Geach calls some mental remnant of the person. That's all that would survive. It wouldn't be you, it would be a remnant of you. Like if my liver survives my death and is somehow kept, I don't think that Clack has survived. It's just a part of me, a remnant of me. And it's the same Geach things with the mind. We presume that the mind is us, but in fact it's just a tiny part of us. Hence, Geach, defending the resurrection, said, apart from the possibility of resurrection, it seems to me a mere illusion to have any hope for life after death. I am of the mind of Judas Maccabeus, if there is no resurrection, it is superfluous and vain to pray for the dead. Now, this, of course, is not to say that the idea of resurrection is itself unproblematic, and Geach admits that, but he thinks it's far preferable to any truncated, disembodied notion of survival. And to address the concept of resurrection of the body, I'm delighted to welcome up here my good friend, Dr. Turner Nevitt.
It's true what Brian said, that the doctrine of the immortality of the soul is deeply problematic. The doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is perhaps not equally problematic, but problematic as well, and I'll have something to say about that. But first, on a positive note, the doctrine of the resurrection of the body or of the dead has historically been a point of unity for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, historically all of whom have at some point or another affirmed the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead or the resurrection of the body. But it's absolutely central to Christianity. The Apostles' Creed, for example, professes belief in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. The Nicene Creed says, I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. The Athanasian Creed says that at Christ's coming, quote, all men shall rise again with their bodies. Early Christian creeds capturing what was essential for Christians to believe in order to be baptized. So central was the doctrine of the resurrection to Christianity that, in fact, in the early period of Christianity, the surrounding pagan world, hearing rumors of this new religion, thought that Christians worshipped a new god called resurrection, anastasis. So often was the word on the lips of Christians. Because it was the fact of the resurrection that was really the foundation of this new religion, Christianity. The central fact, of course, was the resurrection of Jesus, but his resurrection from the dead was seen as bound up with, or you could say even a vindication of, a belief in the general resurrection. The two were seen as one. And it was this belief in the resurrection of the body or of the dead that was the hallmark of early Christian belief about the afterlife. That belief has been subsequently eclipsed by belief in the immortality of the soul. And so much so that I've had students, even Christian students, who've come to me after class, and they told me they never even heard of this doctrine of the resurrection of the body. They thought the Christian hope for the afterlife was a hope of eternal life in separation from the body and in the disembodied, happy union with God forever. They had never even heard of the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. If you read the New Testament, however, I guess that passé Christian text, you'll hear almost nothing at all about the immortality of the soul. It's hardly mentioned, only intimations, and I don't wish to deny their significance. But the dominant theme is one of the resurrection of the body. That comes through so often. And perhaps never more emphatically than in the very earliest text of the New Testament, St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. So in the 15th chapter, it begins with what seems to be something like the very earliest Christian creed, actually, a basic formula of Christian beliefs. And he says there, now I would remind you, brethren, in what terms I preach to you the gospel, which you've received, in which you stand, by which you are saved, if you hold it fast, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Then it goes on to talk about him appearing first to Cephas and then to the 12 and 500 other people and eventually to St. Paul. Paul immediately then goes on to explicate the close connection between this central event of the resurrection of Jesus and the general resurrection of everyone, the resurrection of the dead in general. And he defends it from those who deny it and yet believe in the resurrection of Jesus. He says, now if Christ is preached as raised from the dead, this was the point of reminding the readers the gospel in the form that he had first delivered it to them. He says, now if Christ is preached as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified of God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, then you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If Christ is not raised from the dead, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then those who have fallen asleep, those who have died, have perished. No immortality of the soul. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all men most to be pitied. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. In this early text, you can see that the resurrection of Christ is seen as closely bound up with the general resurrection of the dead, and the thought that Christ has not been raised to the dead, from the dead immediately leads St. Paul to the realization that that would mean that we're still in our sin, but more importantly for my purposes here, that those who have died have no hope, and that we have hoped in Christ only for this life. If Christ is not raised from the dead, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then our hope in Christ has been only for this life. He doesn't console his readers with hope of an immortal afterlife of the soul or something like that. It doesn't even come up. So the central fact of Christ's resurrection of the dead is seen as a vindication of the general doctrine. Christ is supposed to be the pattern and the promise for the resurrection of all human beings from the dead. That is the central Christian hope for the afterlife. Now, I don't wish to deny the immortality of the soul, and I don't wish to deny its suggestions in the New Testament or in later Christian tradition. My point is simply to say that it has taken on an exaggerated importance by comparison with the resurrection of the body, which should be the central Christian hope for an afterlife. So what can I say then about the resurrection of the body as a philosopher? Well, I certainly don't intend to prove to you that the resurrection of the dead is going to happen. Anyone who believes that the dead will be resurrected, I think must do so simply because God has promised to raise human beings from the dead. No natural power or force could possibly bring back to life every human being who has ever died. And so there can be no natural or philosophical proof of the resurrection of the dead. If it's to happen, it would require an exercise of divine omnipotence, and so a miracle. But it's up to God whether to perform a miracle or not. This is a matter of his sheer will. So there's no way that anyone could possibly prove that the resurrection is going to happen, and no Christian philosopher has claimed to be able to do so. The reason to believe that the dead will be raised is that God has promised to do so. I suppose that you could try to prove it by proving that God exists and that God has indeed given this revelation and that revelation indeed contains this promise. And the establishing of those truths was traditionally the province of the field of theology known as apologetics, or what's now called fundamental theology. In any case, I'm not going to take you through that difficult terrain. Instead, I want to ask, in a sense, an easier question, but you'll see a problematic question, not whether the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is true, but whether it is possible, whether it could happen. Could it even happen that an omnipotent being raise us and everyone else from the dead? That is a question that philosophers have applied much of their attention to. And I want to discuss a few different models of the resurrection of the dead, of how it could happen, and see whether you find them a source for hope or not. So the first model of the resurrection of the dead, how could this happen? I call resurrection as replication. Replication. John Hick defends this kind of model of the resurrection. His idea is to begin with a story like this. Suppose that you attend a conference in London and everyone sees you there and you suddenly disappear. You cease to exist, and sometime later, maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, a perfect replica of you reappears, or in any case, appears in New York. You are found to be existing again in New York, or in any case, someone who looks just like you, who has all of your memories, all of your quirks and charm, all of your memories of the past are there. This person thinks that he or she is you, remembers being in London and disappearing, and showing up in New York is disoriented just as you would be, and so on. Hicks suggests that although this is a very strange story, he thinks that it is possible for this to happen, and that if this happened, we would suppose that the very same person had disappeared in London and had reappeared in New York. On the basis of the exact similarity between the two people, the replication, we would suppose that the person had indeed disappeared and reappeared. And he says that with that thought in mind, he thinks that this would equally be true if the person had died in London and a few weeks later had reappeared alive in just that same way in New York. And he says this would even be so. We would even suppose that it was the same person if we still had the corpse. The corpse here, but in any case, here's the person right next to the identical corpse, but with all the same characteristics and traits and memories. Hicks supposes that we would reasonably extend the idea of the very same person, Brian perhaps, to this replica, to this new person. That is Brian. And so he suggests that one way that God could resurrect each of us is by replicating us, by sometime in the future, through a feat of omnipotence, recreating all of us, perhaps from new matter or something, in exactly the same form, with all the same characteristics and memories, and so on. I don't know if you take any comfort in that thought, but I can at least tell you for myself that I do not. Imagine, Brian Davis puts it this way. He says, imagine that someone was asking you to drink a bottle of poison and sought to assure you, don't worry about the poison. We've arranged for a replica of you to appear in 2 weeks to take your place. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be the least bit relieved. The thought that a replica of me will eventually appear some way down the line is not a great source of hope for me. Incidentally, this is why you should never use a Star Trek transporter. Most people don't realize this because they don't know how Star Trek transporters actually work. But the way they actually work is by taking a scan of you, your body, and finding out where all of the particles are. And then reducing your matter to its constituent elements, all right? It vaporizes you and distributes your matter to the four winds, as it were. But with the scan of you, it then collects new matter at the target location, down on the planet's surface, for example, and it arranges that new matter according to the perfect scan that was taken by the transporter. It creates a replica of you down on the planet's surface or on the transporter pad. It isn't the same matter. It's different matter, arranged in exactly the same way. Well, that's a replica of you. That's not you. I mean, suppose, for example, that you had Michelangelo's David. You take a perfect scan of it with fancy computers. We destroy it, all right, in some act of vandalism. But then we get new marble, and we, with the perfect scan, carve a new David to the exact same specifications. It would be a replica. It wouldn't be Michelangelo's David. It wouldn't be the statue that he had carved. Depending on how we make it, it wouldn't be a carving at all. Okay, it's a replica. It isn't Michelangelo's David, and if you step on a transporter pad, whatever comes out the other side won't be you. What the example shows, I think, is that if we're going to be resurrected, it's going to require some kind of material continuity. It can't be some new matter arranged in exactly the same way. Some replicated you would not be you. It would be a replica. There'll have to be some kind of material continuity, which is a point that Geach is driving at, actually, in that paper from God and the Soul. So this leads me to a different view of the resurrection, a different model, probably the more popular, or perhaps the most popular model, which is resurrection as reassembly. Where's my paper on this? Resurrection as reassembly. Oh, here, it was right in front of me all the time. All right. So if you have a watch or a bike or a computer or some other material thing, and it breaks up, the pieces are distributed on your apartment floor or your garage, you can get your watch back or your bike back by reassembling it. If you take your watch to a repair shop and the repair person takes it apart, puts it back together and gives it back to you, you would think that you would receive back the same watch. If you drop your watch and it falls on the floor, that's the end of your watch for the time being. It's not a watch at all. A broken watch is not a kind of watch any more than a dead cow is a kind of cow. It's beef. But if you can put it back together again, then you'll have your watch back or your bike back. So the thought with resurrection as reassembly is that all the matter that composes you can be tracked down. It still exists somewhere in the biosphere, and an omnipotent being would also have to be omniscient. If the being weren't omniscient, then its power would be limited. So it can identify all the matter that once composed you and reassemble it again and put it back together again and thereby resurrect you. This would be not like a Star Trek transporter, but like Wonka vision. I don't know if you've ever seen Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, if you remember Wonka vision. Do you know this? Everyone knew what I was talking about with Star Trek. Okay, some of you know about Wonka vision. This is the it's the sequence with the big television camera and the little boy, and he gets zapped by the camera, and his pieces get broken up and shot across the top of the room, and then they're reassembled on the other side, but much smaller. Somehow they've shrunk it, but that's Wonka vision, okay? That's how most people think of a Star Trek transporter working, taking your bits and breaking them up and throwing those very bits down, but that's not how the transporter works. But that's how Wonka vision works, and the thought is perhaps resurrection might work that way, by reassembly. This might give you some more hope, and I think that this has been the dominant source of hope for most who have believed in the resurrection, that somehow our bodies can be reassembled. There are some problems, however. One is that perhaps not all of my atoms will survive. Maybe some will be vaporized, reduced to energy, or something like that. Cannibalism has caused a lot of problems for this view historically. The matter that composes me can come to compose someone else if part of me is eaten, or perhaps if all of me is eaten. And then at the resurrection, how will it be sorted out? Who will get the matter that was once a part of a couple people? It's a serious worry for an omnipotent being trying to resurrect everyone who's ever lived. You're laughing, but this is the kind of thing that, yeah, the food of worms as well. Okay. But the problem is you don't have to resurrect the worms. So the fact that they had the matter at one time is no problem. They don't need it anymore.
That's unfair.
But if you and I both had the same matter, then who's going to get it? Okay. More importantly, though, the idea that I could be resurrected by merely being reassembled seems to be incoherent. And the reason is because I'm not composed of the same matter over the whole course of my life. My matter is replaced. About every 7 years or so, it seems at least possible that all of my matter is completely replaced. So if all it took to bring me back to life was to reassemble matter in exactly the same way that I had been assembled, then you could take all of the matter that once composed me when I was 10 years old. An omnipotent being, anyway, could get all of that matter right now and could reassemble it right next to me right now. And if taking that matter and reassembling it were all it took to bring someone back, then my 10-year-old self could be standing right here as a feat of omnipotence. But then my 10-year-old self could truly look at me and say, I am you. And I could look at him and say, you are me. But that's impossible. There's no way that two people could be one and the same person. There's no way that he and I could in fact be the same person. If reassembling all of the matter that once composed me were all it took to bring me back, then it would be possible for us to stand there and to be identical, but of course it isn't. And so it looks like merely bringing back together all of the matter that once composed me could not actually resurrect me. This argument was first formulated by Peter van Inwagen, and he proposed instead another model for resurrection, which I won't be able to talk about in detail, but it's fairly brief, and it's a bit anticlimactic. But I call it resurrection as relocation and revival. Okay. In the literature, it's come to be known as body snatching, and you'll see why once I've read you what Peter Van Inwagen says. He says, it's part of the Christian faith that all men who share in the sin of Adam must die. What does it mean to say that I must die? Just this, that one day I shall be composed entirely of non-living matter. That is, I shall be a corpse. It's not part of the Christian faith that I must at any time be totally annihilated or disintegrate. One might note, he says, that Christ, whose story is supposed to provide the archetype for the story of each man's resurrection, became a corpse, but did not, even in his human nature, cease to exist. It's of course true that men apparently cease to exist, those who are cremated, for example. But it contradicts nothing in the creeds to suppose that this is not what really happens, and that God preserves our corpses contrary to all appearances. Perhaps at the moment of each man's death, God removes his corpse and replaces it with a simulacrum, which is what is burned or rots or buried, and so on. Or perhaps God is not quite so wholesale as this. Perhaps he removes for safekeeping only the core person, the brain and central nervous system, or even some special part of it. These are details, he says. I take it, he says, that this story shows that the resurrection is a feat an almighty being could accomplish. So it's relocation and revival. You think that you buried your parents or your loved ones, but in fact you buried a simulacrum of them. When they died, their body was immediately whisked away, imperceptibly, much faster than we could move a body, but no problem for an omnipotent being, and immediately replaced with a replica. That's the replica that we mourned over and buried, and the real body was whisked away and preserved, put on ice as it were, until the day of the resurrection. And just as you can revive people when they have a heart attack or something like that, an omnipotent being who is able to slow things down and preserve the body could revive it by some feat of omnipotence and bring it back to life. Now this model has its problems as well. One is that it implies that God is a deceiver. It doesn't work very well for people who are vaporized, for example, in a nuclear blast. There's no body then to be snatched away. If you snatch them away 1 second before they're vaporized, they're still alive. Does God then kill them and hold them in a holding pattern? But if you try to take them 1 second after they're vaporized, they're gone. There's no body to whisk away. So the model doesn't seem to apply in every case. So it has its problems as well. But maybe just the brain could be whisked away and everything else would be vaporized. Having your brain yanked out might be sufficient thought to be dead. Anyway, these I guess Peter Van Inwagen would say are details. So perhaps we have no satisfactory model of the resurrection. There are other models, but I'm out of time, so I won't go into them. But even if we have no satisfactory model of how the resurrection would happen, I think all that means is that we are ignorant about how exactly it would happen. We don't know how an omnipotent being would or could bring this about. The models in our own experience for how things can be brought back, reassembling watches and computers, preserving corpses and perhaps reviving them, or even copying them like the Michelangelo's David. It's not surprising that the models from our own experience about how to bring things back are not adequate to explain or describe how an omnipotent being might bring about the resurrection. But that's just what you would expect, that we would be unable to guess how God might bring something about that only God could bring about. Why should our models for how something might happen even be expected to properly predict or adequately describe a feat that only God in any case could perform at all? So that, I think, is the more comforting thought, at least to those who believe that God has indeed promised to resurrect the dead. Because as Peter Geach said, anyone who shares that promise should hardly wish to take out a philosophical insurance policy in case God's promise should fail. Thank you.
Although my specialty is in India, and so one would assume that reincarnation was my forte, I have dabbled in Christian theology and Hindu-Christian dialogue. So the whole concept of resurrection is also quite fascinating to me and what its implications for. I must say, although I did have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, And I survived that training. And perhaps because Plato was my favorite topic. And I don't think you guys would be offended if I said that Plato called himself a philosopher, but was certainly not a philosopher in the contemporary sense of the modern academy, for better or for worse. So my training is in religious studies and history of religion. So I'm not particularly interested in the physics or chemistry of these ideas, or even the intelligibility so much. I would be more interested in the phenomenology. What do these ideas mean to those who take them seriously? How are their lives affected? One could also say I'm interested in the aesthetics of these ideas, the ethics, moral implications. But whether or not they are real, true, or possible, I leave that to other specialists. So I'm going to be looking at Plato, and thankfully Professor Clack neglected to touch on the fact that he's also taught reincarnation. And indeed, the doctrine of reincarnation is difficult, certainly in the Hindu tradition and in Plato, to separate from the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. Jennifer will tell us that the Buddhists manage to do it quite well. And of course, the Buddhists teach the doctrine of no soul. We probably don't have time to talk about that today. So is there a thing that helps me advance? Is it up here? So I'm going to start with a debt to, and thanks to Professor Clack for his talk last week. And he spoke about dealing with the anxiety of death. I'm going to add bereavement and add one other methodology here. So Dr. Clack spoke of avoidance. Simply, let's not think about it. Let's repress the whole thing. Calm acceptance. I believe the Stoics were mentioned. And this would apply to many traditions of Asia, Buddhism, and Hindu asceticism. Assurance of another and better state. Well, this is often involved in reincarnation. It's involved, the concept of resurrection is a similar notion. So this will be important, not only for those who are facing death, but for those who are bereaved and would be comforted to understand that their departed beloved ones are in a better place. Ritual management and transformation will come in when we get to Bali in Indonesia, which is a place that I've been traveling to, and Dr. David Harnish, my colleague in music, has been my guru in that area, and so I'm beginning to be quite interested in that. It's a rather different approach that does not exactly involve immortality of the soul, but the ritual creation of immortality. I would say not the inherent immortality, but the ritual creation of immortality. As Professor Nevitt pointed out, the doctrine of resurrection may or may not involve the idea of the soul's inherent immortality. My understanding is that there is some debate in the Christian tradition as to whether the immortality in resurrection is something that is granted by God, bestowed by God. So in that case, it would not be this kind of Platonic, inherent, built-in, pre-existent kind of thing with immortality. So we'll be looking at these. There's some terms for reincarnation. You've probably heard them. Some of them a little esoteric. Transmigration, metempsychosis, palingenesis. This particular one, this last one can have a wider scope of meaning, but basically they mean rebirth, recreation. These are the Sanskrit words on the last line, punarbhava, punarjanma. It means being born again in a physical sense, recreation, rebirth. So here's our friend Plato, at least probably imaginary image of him, and we've already seen this painting. But the immortality of the soul is very much a part of Plato's teaching, as it is of Hindu teaching. So it's immortal, uniform, indissoluble, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you get into the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, you often get a hierarchical dualism, as Professor Clack mentioned, where you get soul good, eternal, blissful, body bad. And Plato is particularly eloquent in his discussion of the negative implications of being embodied, and especially in this particular one of his dialogues, the Phaedo. So the body leads the philosopher astray. The philosopher should despise the body. The body is an imperfection. I'm going to go through some of these because we've already covered some of this ground. So if the body is a bad thing, if death is a separation of the soul from the body, if the soul is what it's all about, then we should try, said Plato through his teacher in this imaginary discussion, Socrates, we should live as close as possible to death. Indeed, where are we here? He spoke of philosophy as the profession of philosophy being preparation for death. So, immortality of the soul, pre-existence of the soul. This is not from the Phaedo, this is the Phaedrus, where he talks about that each one of us, before being incarnated in this heavy body of a prison of a body, has a vision, a heavenly vision of truth, of perfection, of blissful goodness, untainted by the body in which we are now stuck, as he says, like an oyster in its shell. So, Plato did, in fact, believe in reincarnation. And we believe that he got this notion from the ancient Orphic traditions and especially from the Pythagoreans, who also are into vegetarianism and other strange stuff. Okay, so this idea was there. What the relationship between ancient Greek ideas of reincarnation and ancient Indian ideas of reincarnation, what that relationship is, cultural diffusion, independent origination, it's debatable. But the idea is that the soul of the philosopher, when a true philosopher, when he dies, goes to this heavenly realm. Now there's some discussion here about the translation of this word God in Plato, which we don't have time to get into, but it's a blissful place, a heavenly paradise, which the philosopher can look forward to. And this would be a kind of final disembodied immortality. Similar, we'll see that the Hindu tradition has an idea of moksha. You go through many lives. The Buddhists have a similar notion, and you get to this final, eternal state of immortality. And then the ignorant, well, they kick around for a while, get punished for their bad conduct, and get imprisoned once again in a body. And the middling people, the good, well, they might become a disciplined creature, a social creature like a bee or a wasp, or even come back into the human race again, becoming decent citizens. So what about consolation in the face of death? This is where one of the interests that I have. Well, how does a religious idea provide, have a social function, consolation? And what he's saying is he's sitting around just about to drink his hemlock with his followers, and he says, look, when I die and you see my body being carried out, don't say it's Socrates that's being carried out. I'm out of here. I'm gone. Okay? It's only my body that you are burying. So the idea that this would be, I suppose, the idea that there's a better state after life, and that your loved one is in a better state in the afterlife, which would be obviously of some consolation. So that's Plato, his notion of reincarnation. It involves immortality of the soul and likewise degradation of the body, a kind of hierarchical dualism. Please note that the doctrine of the resurrection, as I understand it, I am open to correction, but the doctrine of the resurrection in Christianity and other traditions says that this body that you have right now is somehow an integral part of who you are. But we'll see, especially in the Hindu tradition, but there's the same implication in this concept of reincarnation. Reincarnation says that the body that you have now will be replaced by another body, and you had another body before. So this particular body is really not at all integral to who you are. It's kind of irrelevant. It's a temporary, as we shall see, it's a temporary housing, as we shall see. So we're going on to the Hindu tradition, the great scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a dialogue between the warrior Arjuna and the divine incarnation, Krishna, who is God. Krishna is God, capital G, on earth to teach and enlighten humanity. And this scripture is a short scripture, about 800 verses. It's much beloved all over India and amongst Hindu diaspora communities around the world. Many devout Hindus will memorize this entire text and recite it every day. And the most important and loved aspects of this text, in addition to its proclamation of God's love for humanity, is the consolation that it provides in the face of death. So immortality of the self, the Otteman, roughly translatable as soul. There never was a time when we did not exist, nor shall we ever cease to exist in the future. The self is never born, it never dies, ancient, unchanging, eternal. Important, it's not destroyed when the body is destroyed. And here we get to the expendability and almost the irrelevance of the human body to who we are. These are the funeral pyres burning on the Ganges River in Varanasi, the ancient holy city in North India. So we go through childhood, youth, and old age in this body. So another body comes. Notice, I'm not going to give any Sanskrit lessons today, but the word for body is deha, and the word for this, a synonym for the soul or the self is dehin, the possessor of the body, the owner of the body. Okay? So there's a dualistic, obviously, conception there. And here's perhaps the most interesting and graphic. Just as we put on new garments after just get rid of old and threadbare garments, so the embodied self inquires new bodies. after casting away the old. Now, old clothes. I missed a button. I can't find a button. What the hell? Throw it away. And some of this shirt is getting to be 20 years old. But I'm going to hold on to it for a while because I like it. And it reminds me of Indonesia where I bought it. But someday I'll have to toss it. So, if you can have a devout life, and if when you die you think of God or hear Krishna, if you can focus your mind on God at the time of death, then you will go to be with Krishna. Variously interpreted what that means. A heavenly paradise, a union with Krishna, a blissful communion with Krishna. There are different conceptions, different theologies within Hinduism. But basically this is moksha, liberation from the cycles of birth and rebirth. Through the practice of yoga, meditation, loving relationship with God, you can escape the cycles of rebirth. Otherwise, whatever is strongest in your mind at the time you die, if you're thinking of money, if you're thinking of power, sex, whatever, the teaching is that when you die, what is important to you really comes to the surface. You no longer kid yourself. So that's where you go. Don't think of your pet cat when you die. And if you meet death with an illumined mind, you get to a heavenly world. That could be temporary, you might come back, depending. If you meet death with a mind governed by desire and ambition, you get born amongst people who are attached to worldly action. If you die in a state of stupor, if you're a wicked person, then you go downhill. So the idea is that the course of your rebirth is determined by the moral quality of your life. Everyone knows the word karma. Good. Okay. Consolation for the bereaved. Well, even if you think of the self as taking birth and dying again and again, you shouldn't grieve. Hey, death is certain, unavoidable. Over what is inevitable, you should not lament. All things are manifest before birth, manifest during life, unmanifest again. There's that little bit of stoicism there, perhaps, or just detachment from the reality. But ultimately, the notion is the soul is eternal. The body dies. The soul lives on, and perhaps the person will be reborn. Okay, now I'm going to go to Balinese Hinduism. And the Hinduism in Bali was sort of exported by traders in the early part of the Common Era, the early years of the first millennium, BCE. And it arrived there and mixed up with what we call the indigenous archipelagic religion, the religion of the Southeast Asian islands and the islands of the South Pacific. And so there's Hindu doctrines there, but there's a lot of what we would call animism, spirits, awareness of spirits, and also, most especially, ancestor veneration. In Bali, there's a huge volcano in the middle of the island. The ancestors live up above, actually, that volcano. Highly ritual society. This is a conversation that an anthropologist recorded. It is a spirit of a departed ancestor speaking through a shaman, a Balian, to the family. And the way it works is the family, after 12 days of the child's birth, takes their child to the shaman. They call him Balian in Bali. And the object of that little journey to see the neighborhood shaman is to find out the identity of the new child. Who are you? Who is this person? And what that points to is an interesting and rather unique form of reincarnation, at least Hindu reincarnation. You find this in other cultures, but it's different from Indian Hinduism in that you reincarnate in the same family. Usually it's the patriline, the father's family, but not always. So here is the ancient ancestor or the young child, you pick who it is speaking through the shaman. Hey, you are hearing me? I have been staying too long in the world over there. That's what we call it. Until now, I have found no place to come down and ask for rice. Ask for rice means to be born again. So I have no other choice than to incarnate again amongst you children. Get it? Children is interesting. But will you be able to look after me? There was a little problem in this particular family because this soul was coming from the mother's line, and it had trouble. There was problems in the previous life with the father's family. And of course they say, sure, please tell us who you are. And I am Nikirti. I say, oh, yeah, we remember that, and so on and so on. Okay? So the main thing is here we are reincarnation in the family. And reincarnation of the ancestors is the big idea. The interesting concepts here, a child in Bali is said to be still a god for the first 105 days of their life. And that is symbolized by the fact that they are not allowed to touch the ground. Okay? They're supposed to be pure, angelic, the divinized ancestor come back to earth. So for that sort of initiatory period of this new sojourn on earth, they are not allowed to touch the ground, but then they have a special ceremony where they say, okay, you're here now, better get used to it. And they touch the child's feet to the ground. Here's an anthropologist, Hornbacher, who spent quite a long time in Bali. And she says that when she asked the villagers for their views concerning ultimate liberation and reincarnation, which is an Orthodox Hindu doctrine, she was puzzled by the fact that most of them declared they did not even want to be liberated from reincarnation, but rather preferred to be reborn in their families. They said, even some of them went further, saying that the true meaning and ultimate goal of moksha, this liberation, was actually reincarnation, or at least returning to the family temple as a divinized ancestor. When you die, your family has to give you an elaborate and expensive ritual cremation that goes for more than 6 months. It can last with different ceremonies over a year. And that converts you into a divinized ancestor. If they don't do that ceremony, they will do it because they're afraid that if they don't do it, you'll become a ghost and haunt them. So even if you were a bad person, your family and your village will give you a nice funeral and convert you into a divinized ancestor because they'd be afraid of what might happen if they didn't do it. So this brings us to the famous and elaborate cremation rituals of Bali. And this brings us to the point 4 I had on my first slide, where it talked about ways of dealing with anxiety about death and bereavement. The Balinese cremation is this elaborate process. Here we see two funerals being conducted together, two cremations, and the body is placed in this bull sarcophagus made of sort of paper mache and burnt. There's a lot that goes on before and a lot that goes on after this, taking the soul, the ashes to the ocean and purifying them and so on and so on. But the basic idea is that, this again is Hornbacher, says it's common among family members to alleviate grief by providing ritual support for a quick rebirth in the family. So it's not, dad or mom or the child are in a happy place. Actually, the transition state between death and becoming a divinized ancestor is not such a happy state. So as soon as possible, you want to do the funeral, convert the soul of your ancestor into a happy spirit, a divinized ancestor, and hope for their quick rebirth into this life. So here is a notion of reincarnation that does not devalue embodied life. It's not celebration and the intrinsic connection of self with a particular body, but it does not, interestingly, devalue embodied life. You know, another life? Cool. Where do I sign up? You know, you see this same idea in Native American traditions. So that's, I think that's my last slide.
We have, I think, about time for one question or reflection from the end. And then obviously if you want to have a chat with any of us at the end, please do. So does anyone? Yeah.
Regarding the Christian resurrection of the body, is it thought of that the body that you have when you die will be resurrected? Because of course your body changes a ton from conception to death, at least for people that live the full human lifespan. I think most people would want a youthful body, but I've never really understood what is my body actually going to be resurrected as? Which body?
Yeah, so do you think that you actually have a different body than you had 10 years ago?
Yeah, because doesn't your skin shed and, you know, you might lift weights or lose weight or, I mean, your muscles are different.
Yeah. Well, I know that your matter has been replaced, but it's a different question about whether you have a different body. If your body were simply that set, excuse me, of matter, if you were just a set of a certain quantity of matter, then you could never have the same body, as it were, with anything coming or going. But I would be more inclined to say that you have the same body that you've always had. Your matter has been replaced, but I mean, here's one reason for thinking that. You just are that body. You're the organism sitting in that chair right there, and that organism is the same one that lived 10 years ago. It isn't a different organism. It's not a different animal. You're not a different person. You're the same animal and the same organism, in spite of the fact that the matter has been replaced. Now, it's an interesting question about how it is that you can have the same organism or the same animal, or I'm saying the same body, in spite of replacement of matter. But I don't think the mere fact that the matter comes and goes means that you have a different body any more than it means that you're a different animal or a different organism. But there is a question about which, given that there needs to be material continuity, that was part of what I was defending, which matter then should be gathered or resurrected or whisked away or whatever. And the traditional view has been that it'll be the last matter that you had. That's the stuff that's supposed to get reassembled, or that would be the stuff that would be whisked away.
But could I not, presumably, I was much better at the age of 35 than I am now. But when I come back, is this the point? Am I going to be looking like I was when I was 35, or will I be, if I get to be 92, which is unlikely, will I be that?
Yeah, so again, the resurrection of Jesus was supposed to be the model. Jesus' resurrection was both the pledge and the pattern for our resurrection. And Jesus' body was, although it was the same body, it was his body, but it was changed and transformed. The term is glorified. Now, there are a lot of interesting questions about what that glorification involves, what the change involves. If it's too much change, then you might wonder if it's even the same body, if it undergoes too much change or too radically. But the traditional view has been that the body will be not only resurrected, but as it were, restored to a prime condition, as Christ's was. This raises interesting questions, though, about disabilities and the role that they play in personal identity. The traditional view has been that actually, I suppose there isn't a traditional view. That it was controversial about how to think about disabilities or deformities in the body. Actually, this comes up in the quodlibetal questions that I translate. The specific question is whether the bodies of the damned will be raised with their deformities. And the puzzle is because everyone's body is supposed to be glorified, so you'd expect the deformities in the body of the damned to be eliminated. On the other hand, it seems like the damned don't deserve to get really nice bodies back. They ought to have deformed bodies. So there's a tension between what it looks like the damned would deserve and the glorification that all resurrected bodies ought to have. The way that it becomes controversial in the context of modern disabilities is that there's a new sense that a person's disabilities are closely tied or integral to their identity. So much so that some people with disabilities would not want to lose their disabilities. They feel very much as if their identity is closely bound up with them, so much so that then there's a question about, well, will I have my disabilities in the resurrection or not? If I have them, then it looks like I won't be perfectly happy. If I don't have them, it looks like I won't be myself. In other words, that I won't be resurrected at all. These are interesting puzzles, interesting questions about the traditional view. But the traditional view has been that the body will be glorified. It's supposed to be the very same body. And the reason for that is because I am that body, right? It isn't a possession. That's me. That's why the same body has to come back, because otherwise I won't come back. So it's supposed to be the same body, and that requires material continuity. But it's supposed to be transformed and glorified as well. Yeah.
Now, at the risk of going over, I did notice two hands up. Kayla and Jessica both had points. Did you want to raise your questions before we end?
Mine has to do with Plato, though, so it's kind of...
Well, that's perfectly within the remit of...
Okay. I just have a question thinking about this idea of reincarnation with Plato, because I know we often focus on, like, the Phaedo, but in his, like, much neglected cosmology and the Theatitis, he mentions about how every soul is a male soul, and he gives reason for differing genders of bodies, because being unvirtuous in a past life would then mean, it very much follows like Homer's mythology of Prometheus and whatnot, but the fallen would then have the female bodies, but all still have the same souls in this fact that they're male souls, and that they can like become better in the life and then come back as like a different body. And I know we so often talk about like him as like this perfect like stable, blissful, this final disembodied reality, a better state, a better afterlife, and those seem like their intention. And I was just wondering if like this cosmology then is like the notion of the cycle, where then like Socrates being the philosopher was out of the cycle, and that's why this like dual view of there being a disembodied life, which you would presume to be like sexless, genderless, just different from the form of you, can like coincide with his other text of this reoccurring of the all male souls and like difference of bodies due to different virtues in past lives.
That's interesting.
And good question. I mean, I'm not an expert in Plato. I'm not familiar with that particular text. Certainly, the culture at that time was highly patriarchal, and no one said that Plato I think no one here said that Plato was a saint, or his teacher Socrates either.
Sure. Well,
Socrates is supposed to have treated his family rather poorly.
Yeah. It's interesting, but it's a Pythagorean idea, actually, the preference of male over female. There's an interesting list of like dichotomous values and disvalues. Do you know that list of the Pythagorean values? Yeah, exactly. And of course, male's on the good side and female, right? White on the good side, black on the right. And so I mean, I say of course because it. Yeah. Well, no, I mean because it's just what you would expect given a whole host of really horrible stereotypes. But I think that must be a part of the Platonic ideal that the ideal soul would be a male soul. And I guess Aristotle even gets this idea as well. I mean, you must be aware of this, but the kind of ancient theory that the female is actually the defective male.
The
right?
inverted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that male is like what you would get if the gestational development went naturally, but if it goes wrong, then you'll get the defective male, which would be the female. That's the Aristotelian
So perhaps
theory.
then, like.
But it's basically this Pythagorean, or anyway, I would trace it to Pythagoras.
Okay.
Huh? Yeah.
Okay, because that makes sense. And I mean, then it follows, like Aristotle's, like the male is the only one who can ensoul, because like if it is a male soul. But yeah, I just wonder, like this disembodied, this focus on like this soul that is nothing seems to be in contention. So I just wonder if maybe because he was the philosopher, like the soul ends at that point, or if any. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Really helpful.
I can assure you that the Hindu concept of the soul is same. It's genderless. And Sanskrit has a neuter gender, and not only the same in you and I, but in bugs, you know. So
Interesting.
That's pretty democratic and non-hierarchical, at least in that
It's
sense.
interesting.
I like that comment about this
Yeah, good
status,
question.
the status of Socrates in that image, as someone who's sort of gone outside of the wheel of reincarnation. It's fascinating. I'm really close to the end time, but I'm going to give you the last word or the last question, and then we will hit the road.
Super quick note, so in the Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha, it's sort of related to that. Everyone is, it's a very sensual environment, but everyone is supposed to have identical bodies. So there's that same kind of genderlessness, but moreover, everyone is completely identical, so there's no hierarchy. But my question, maybe for Turner, but people could weigh in. So Lance talked about how in the Bhagavad Gita, like the state of mind at death is very important. And that's also true in Pure Land Buddhism. Like they're very concerned with having you have the, visualize the Pure Land at that moment. But I was also struck, having read a lot of accounts by 19th century missionaries in Thailand who were dropping like flies. I mean, they were dying right and left of diseases. And the missionaries, these were Protestant missionaries, they were always very, very concerned to give an account of the death and to talk about no matter how bad it was, they had this moment of lucidity and they accepted Jesus and then they passed in a very calm and accepting way. And I was just wondering why in Christianity that state of mind at the moment of death was important. Because presumably you're either saved or you aren't, depending on various other conditions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, the idea that you're either saved or you aren't is a Protestant idea, but that's what's so puzzling about the story you told, that Protestant missionaries would be so concerned with the state of the person's mind right at the moment of death. Because the Protestant idea is the once saved, always saved, right? If you've authentically accepted Jesus, then that means you're saved, you can't lose your salvation. That's not a Catholic idea. The Catholic idea is that you can, in fact, lose your salvation. You can be justified by grace and then commit mortal sin and return to a state of condemnation. So in the Catholic tradition, that's why your state at the moment of death is so important, because it determines your state in the afterlife, as it were. The Protestant idea, I guess, the only way that I could explain it is that the reason that they believe in the once saved, always saved doctrine is because they also believe in what's called the perseverance of the saints. And so the thought is that if you really were saved, then you will be given the gift of perseverance as well. That whatever good work God has begun in you, God will bring to completion. I guess the thought is that it would have been pointless for God to have saved you here if you were just going to lose it later, or he was going to let you lose it later. So he grants you the gift of perseverance as well. And that is perhaps why they're so concerned about the state of the person's mind right at death, because I guess it would be a sign of that perseverance. Maybe that they had indeed persevered in the salvation which they had once had, because it's that perseverance that is supposed to guarantee the once saved, always saved. I mean, you could caricature that view as being, oh, okay, well, I've accepted Jesus, now I can go sow my wild oats, do whatever I want. But typically that would be seen as an indication that your conversion was not authentic, that actually you weren't saved. The fruit of your conversion would be the good works. That would also be the sign of your perseverance, I guess, yeah. But it's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that of Protestant missionaries. That's fascinating.
Well, it is fascinating. It's a great question. Thank you all for being here.